these truths to be self-evident.
That all men are created equal.
As a member of Congress, I get to have a lot of really interesting people in the office. Experts on what they're talking about.
This is the podcast
for insights into the issues.
China, bioterrorism, Medicare for all. In-depth discussions.
Breaking it down into simple terms. We hold
these truths. We hold these truths.
With Dan Crenshaw.
The Eagle has landed.
Welcome back, everybody. Look, you listen to this podcast because it's an inside look at what happens in Congress. This is not just another talking head political podcast, just telling you the same things that everybody else is telling you. We have some inside info, and there is no better inside info than the episode we're going to have today with Representative Garret Graves. Garret, thanks for being here.
Hey, you bet. Great to be back.
So, Garrett's from Louisiana. You're from Louisiana, representative from Louisiana. How long have you been? When did you first get elected?
I got first elected in 2014, so sworn in January 2015.
Okay. Man, you kind of seems like you've been here a lot longer. You're obviously, the reason we're having you on today is because you were trusted as the Speaker's head negotiator for the debt ceiling deal. Now, everyone listening, saw that drama play out, frankly, over the course of many months. I mean, this debt ceiling drama really, nobody was really paying attention to it back then. Back in January, President Biden was saying, we will never negotiate a debt ceiling with the Republicans. It will only be clean. We won't even talk about it. Slowly came to the realization that especially after we passed an actual debt ceiling bill with provisions in it, so it would not be a clean debt ceiling. It was called the Limit Save Grow Act, had wide support amongst Republicans. Maybe we lost a couple on that vote. Showed them that they had to negotiate, and you were tasked with that. But you worked here before, right? You were a chief of staff before. There's a reason you seem to be a little bit more experienced than just somebody who was elected in 2014. Can we start there? Actually, what was it about your background that you were tasked with this pretty important negotiation on behalf of the Speaker?
Well, look, I certainly can't speak for him, but I believe, based on conversations,
because I'm awesome. Just say it, Garret.
Look, this was a pretty huge thing. I mean, we were talking about negotiating trillions and trillions of dollars. In a previous life, I had negotiated what ended up being the largest settlement from a single company in U.S. history. Negotiated tens of billions of dollars in different contracts and negotiations. Talk
about the BP oil spill.
The BP oil spill was the negotiated settlement, and then also rebuilding levees after Hurricane Katrina, the coastal wetlands after Hurricane Katrina, and just been involved in a lot. And I think the Speaker was looking for someone who had negotiating experience on large deals like this and large negotiations. And I think that's why he asked us to do it.
Yeah. So you and Patrick McHenry were the leads on this. Patrick, clearly because of he's chairman of financial services, has a understanding of the financial ramifications of debt default, and that's different than a government shutdown, right? We should probably say that.
Yeah, it is. And look, just real quick on Patrick McHenry. One of the really important things was understanding what is your real D-Day in terms of default. Yeah. What is the real backstop there? Because if the White House knew what it was and we didn't, they would have a negotiating advantage because we would want to maximize leverage. And so having him in the room was really helpful because he knew this stuff well enough to be able to tell us where the real backstop was and where our maximum negotiating point was. So that was absolutely key, having him in the room as well. And then in regard to shutdown versus default, shutdown is when you don't pass the appropriations bills to continue funding government. Default is when you do not have the ability to borrow funds to meet your financial obligations. So it's sort of like in the case of the debt ceiling default, it's sort of like you hitting your credit card limit and not having the monthly payment for that month as well. So really can cause a lot of problems.
We ever defaulted?
We have not, and it is projected that if we had, it would have caused trillions of dollars in implications on the markets and impacting retirement plans and things like that. It would have driven up interest rates for both individuals as well as the government on the debt.
And the reason it drives up interest rates is simply because, once it becomes clear that an entity, in this case the U.S. government, won't pay its debts, well, those in order to borrow money, it becomes riskier and therefore more expensive, and that's just the explanation, right, as to why interest rates would go up. It makes our debt worse. It makes your 401k disappear, it's bad. Like it's not like shutting down the government. I'm not sure there's a ton of I'm not sure that many people notice because it's happened plenty of times. Not sure people notice that much when we shut down the government. This is a little different. Okay, so all right, so we passed Limit, Save, Grow. Okay, that was difficult enough to wrangle everybody onto that. A very strong conservative like debt ceiling bill. Okay, it had a lot of provision. It was basically all of HR 1. It had our like wish list of stuff. Okay. I thought it was pretty well socialized, and everybody said that was kind of our initial goalpost, and we knew we wouldn't get that, not with the slim majority we had on the House. Okay, so when did Biden finally invite you guys in? When did that first? What was our first conversation like here?
Yeah, so let's keep in mind, Limit, Save, Grow, again, great legislation, but that was done in sort of the vacuum of a Republican conference. We unfortunately couldn't get bipartisan support for it. So as you indicated, President Biden was saying no negotiation, no negotiation. After we passed Limit, Save, Grow, actually dating back, so even before Limit, Save, Grow, I believe it was on February 1st, the president and the speaker met. The president indicated then he wanted to continue having meetings, wanted him back, knew they could work this out, and yet 97 days passed before they had a second meeting, and it was because they were trying to run out the clock, as you said, and because we had passed Limit, Save, Grow, which forced the White House to come to the table.
Okay, so what's your first meeting like here, and like what you're walking in there, Actually, just give me your impressions, then I have a lot of specific questions.
Yeah, so look, first meeting was us sort of putting Limit, Save, Grow on the table and saying, okay, here's the starting point in negotiations. White House basically taking their budget request to the Congress, which included additional taxes and all sorts of things that were just awful policies, and saying, okay, here's ours. And we were like, all right, well, that's a non-starter, let's be clear. And so it was a little bit of a, kind of
it felt unrealistic.
It did, and it was a little bit of arching backs and, what is your starting point? But look, we ended up kind of distilling it down to where, one, the speaker did a great job getting Chuck Schumer out of the room, getting Hakeem Jeffries.
Explain that. So explain why that was a problem. Like, so in this first meeting, were they all in the room?
They were.
And what's the room? Are we in the Oval Office? Where are we?
There was a meeting in the Oval, and it included Chuck Schumer, the Senate Majority Leader. It included Mitch McConnell, the Senate Minority Leader, Hakeem Jeffries, the Democrat leader in the House, and the Speaker. And so the Speaker very quickly realized that a lot of those other people shouldn't be in the room. The Senate didn't pass a bill. They didn't have a position. Schumer couldn't get anything through, despite out there saying this needs to be a clean bill, a clean debt ceiling increase. They didn't have any position of the Senate to actually qualify them to be in the room. So the Speaker, one of the first wins he got was being able to get everyone else out of the room except for the Speaker of the House and the President. Those were the negotiating
and
parties.
Their teams, obviously.
Yeah. And those are the negotiating parties.
Okay, so what's it like talking to President Biden about this? Like, who's talking? That's the question everyone has.
So look, in terms of the president, that was really the Speaker of the House and the president engaging directly at that level.
Yeah.
We were engaging with the chief of staff, the deputy chief of staff, the head of the White House Office Management and Budget, folks like that, which, it was I think sort of levelized.
So is it mostly the Speaker and the President literally just alone in the room at many points?
No, the majority of the negotiations were at that next level where it was me in the room with.
And then they kind of you brief your principals here. You're briefing the president, or not you, but his guys are briefing him, and then he goes to McCarthy. And they sort of have a top-level conversation.
So we tried to push as much of the negotiation down to our level as possible, to where we were negotiating with the White House cabinet officials, the White House deputy chief of staff, and others, and get as many things resolved there. There were a few things that early on they said this is going to have to be principal level, meaning the president and the Speaker of the House.
For some major things. And if you're not going to say it, I'm going to say it. So, the reason is obvious. Like, I wouldn't. President Biden is not going to know the amount of detail that is necessary to have a real conversation about this.
That's fair.
Yeah, it seems obvious, right? Like,
No, you're exactly right.
And that was when he was at his height, right? So which is not the case right now. So so that's interesting. You guys are having conversations constantly throughout in different rooms, and then bringing it to the Oval Office. How many total? Like, what are we?
We met probably daily for about 2.5 weeks.
Okay. And how long are these meetings? How long are you just going at it? And do you break? And because okay, let's huddle. Like, how does this work? How?
So Dan, the shortest one was probably about 10 minutes, and I'll tell you how that one went down. This was when some of the information on where negotiations were had leaked out, and we believe that Hakeem Jeffries, the Democrat leader in the House, and Chuck Schumer, Democrat leader in the Senate, blew up the White House, of course, verbally, and said, this is ridiculous, we'll never agree to this. And so we go into a meeting, White House starts backsliding in regard to some of the numbers we were negotiating on. So we basically, the meeting really devolved quickly when they were trying to increase spending, and folks started yelling at each other, and some words were said that I won't repeat here. And
you can say whatever you want on my podcast, Garret. It's my podcast. I swear all the time. Sometimes we drink whiskey during the podcast. It's fine.
Kids, if you introduce that dynamic, then maybe. But my wife and kids wouldn't be very happy with me. But I'll just say that. So when things blew up, I basically just stood up and I invited them to leave. And so that meeting lasted about 10 minutes. We had other meetings that went on until, just hours and hours went on till, 1 in the morning maybe. So maybe meeting somewhere 8 hours straight, meet in the morning, take a break, come back, meet in the afternoon. And so all in all, in a single day, the longest we met was probably around 14 hours.
Well, how are you preparing for each day? How did you prepare for the first one? Was it more of a let's just see what they say and go from there?
Yeah.
How much are you guys planning sort of contingencies and plan A, plan B, plan C kind of things?
Look, I think what's most important in a situation like this is know what you know and know what you don't know. And you never want to go into a negotiation where the other side has the upper hand because of knowledge. So I knew what I knew. I knew where I needed help. You had folks like Britton and Jason on the speaker staff that know the budget and numbers as well as anyone. They were phenomenal. You had Emily Dominich and Ashley from the speaker staff and Ashley from Resources Committee, these great people on permitting and natural resources. And of course, I've got a lot of background there too. We brought in the speaker's now chief of staff, Michaela Carr, who was helping us out on the legal side, John Legansky and Natalie Joyce helping us out on the strategic side. So look, we brought in people from Agriculture Committee on the SNAP and food stamp issues. Just bringing in experts from different committees in areas where we needed help. I talked to
and the point of that being to what? To prioritize what you would ask for, I suppose, like what you'd give up, what you'd demand, so, like where your red lines are, because is that?
Let me give you an example. If we knew that we were going to be negotiating work requirements for welfare or food stamps, we pulled in people from the Speaker's office that were experts as well as from the Agriculture Committee that were experts. We talked about different ideas and different strategies. What is a win here? What's not a win? Where are some of the problems? So we would do that. Then we would go into negotiation, get as far as we could. And then what we would often do is we would actually do a sidebar. And sometimes we do it over the phone, sometimes in person. But we would sidebar and actually pull those people into the negotiations and have discussions with a smaller group talking about that specific issue. So that's kind of how it went down. But the main thing is making sure that you are never sort of overpowered in a negotiation because they knew more than you did. Okay,
so you got that dynamic going, and then there's the whole timeline of it. So you mentioned before the importance of knowing what an accurate timeline is as far as when a real dangerous default happens. Yellen pushed that from June 1st and to June 5th. When it all got wrapped up, we were all in Codels. Everybody was like, I remember it was getting wrapped up on a Saturday and then fully wrapped up on a Sunday. And, that was a week before the technical day. So what was the hurry to wrap it up all of a sudden in that weekend? Like what was going on? What happened?
Well, so look, you said this before and you're exactly right. The reason the president refused to meet with the speaker again for 100 days was because they were trying to use the backstop of default against us. That was absolutely their strategy. And so we had actually crossed over the line. If you counted, it takes 3 days to get a bill through the House. It takes 5, maybe even 7 days to get a bill through the Senate. If you maximize
so that's how you were
timelines.
calculating that.
So we were looking at that. So we had already actually crossed over the line for June 1st, but that was when Patrick McHenry had told us we had more time. When they did the June 5th deadline, Technically, we had crossed over it as well, that June 5th deadline, considering how many days it would take get a bill through the Congress. But we also were in touch with Mitch McConnell and others about the timeline they thought they could squeeze it to. So look, White House knew we were serious. They knew we would take us to the brink if they were unwilling to negotiate. And look, at the end of the day,
it becomes a staring contest with respect to this like deadline, because it's not obvious from a political standpoint who gets blamed. I'm still not sure, even in hindsight, who would have been blamed. Hard to say. How are you guys feeling about that at that point?
Look, we didn't feel like blame would fall on us because we had done our job. We had passed the bill.
Already passed it.
The Senate had
and a lot of us kept messaging that over and over again. Just to be clear, just to remind everyone, we already passed the debt ceiling increase.
So if they didn't want to default, the Senate could pass our bill and send it to the president. We'd be there. And so we talked about that a lot. But look, at the end of the day, you have to keep in mind, there would have been trillions of dollars in financial implications on average Americans. And as you know, under President Biden, stock market has shed trillions of dollars.
Blame is one thing, but actual consequences are another thing. The question is, like, how far would Biden himself go? Hard to say. I guess we don't know. But there's, so there's a lot of strengths that we devised for ourselves going into it. Whatever, a good team, right? All the knowledge brokers, good strategy. I think we asked for very reasonable things. We'd already passed something, but there are some weaknesses too. So, which is important to note, because here again, you don't have to say it, but I'll say it. Like, going into these negotiations, and this is unfortunate, that on the one side, you've got people who will never vote for a debt ceiling increase. They would vote for that first one because it was like every Republican wish list ever. But that you already know you've lost their votes. And the unfortunate reality is Biden also knows you lost those votes. So they know you have to negotiate. And that sucks. On the other hand, on the other end of the spectrum, your more moderate Republicans who are in Biden, plus 10 districts, they're very afraid of brinksmanship. They would cross over if the negotiations fail and vote with Democrats for a clean debt ceiling. Like, these things going into it. Yeah. It took a lot of leverage away, did it not?
Yep. So you had to think about your backstop as not just being default, but the other pressure relief valve is if a group of moderate senators got together and did a clean or relatively clean debt ceiling bill and jammed it on the House. If some of the moderates in the House decided to sign the discharge petition that the Democrats were pushing in the House. So look, you had to watch all of those different things and make sure that one of those pressure relief valves didn't blow, because then we lose all leverage. But look, at the end of the day, I think when you look at this bill, Dan, you have to look at it like a package. And so in some cases, maybe we didn't get everything we wanted on work requirements, but we got more on permitting. So we were thinking about that overall tension. But at the end of the day, this was the largest savings of any legislation in the history of Congress. Think about that for just a minute. Yeah. We're saving over $2.1 trillion by forcing budget caps, by forcing spending reductions on this administration, taking back over $21 billion that they're using to fund IRS agents, largest rescission or taking funds back from agencies in the history of Congress, including funds that inexplicably our government was trying to give to the government of China and others, taking all those funds back. There were some huge historic wins in this bill that and you nailed it. You talk about the Limit, Save, Grow, which was a Republican-only sort of venue or legislation, but then you have the realization this has to get to the Democrat-controlled Senate and has to be signed by a Democrat president.
All legislation exists and is contextualized by the political reality we live in at that moment. And that's whether you label something as good, like you are a good basketball player, but you're actually pretty shitty compared to a real basketball player. So it's everything has to be contextualized, and I made that note when we were all debating this. So you noted a bunch of the good things in it. We won't get into too much into the details of that. I think that's kind of been hashed out. I want the more inside info of how we got to this point. Were you surprised? So you guys come out with this bill. This is the best we could get, right? And there was a lot of very immediate backlash, just ready to go from the I don't like to say conservative, because I don't think they're any more conservative than you or I, but from various members actually. So whatever. There's a severe Were you surprised by that?
I was absolutely shocked by it. Here we have one of the most conservative bills that has ever been put forth by Congress. Again. Yeah. Crossed over 8 red lines that the White House or the president had established. Greatest savings ever. And here was the thing.
Because Biden's wish list, that their initial position of their budget.
Yeah.
What did they get out of that?
I will tell you, inside the room, the number of times that the negotiators told us, number one, there is nothing in here for Democrats to support. I mean, I'm telling you, that was said over and over and over again. And
because there was nothing from their budget, nothing. I mean, they tried to twist it later and be like, we solidified things, which is code for the Republicans weren't able to reverse everything we've ever done, right? Which is true. We weren't. Like I didn't get a new eye out of it.
Look,
like I thought I was going to get a new right eye, Garrett. You didn't negotiate that into the bill. I was kind of pissed, but I still voted for it.
I'll tell you two things, kind of inside baseball here. Number one, whenever we were, just pushing them and kept grinding them, telling them we would not relent. They're yelling at us and telling us there's nothing in here to sell the Democrats to vote for. At one point, Patrick McHenry leans across the table and he goes, "That pain you're feeling right now, that's exactly where we want you to be." And I mean, just the whole, our side just all laughing, but he was
because we already passed it. I mean, there was good strategy going into it.
There was, but Dan, here's the thing: why did Democrats vote for this? Because there was nothing in there for the White House.
Right.
Here's why they voted for it: they were put in a box. I'll tell you something just to kind of demonstrate this a little bit. In one of the conversations between Leader Jeffries and the Speaker of the House, Jeffrey said he could get 20 votes. He said, "I can get 20 votes out of Democrats in the House." 20. And that was because the deal, that was after they were briefed. They realized how awful it was for Democrats.
Oh, boy.
So they realized that they were in big trouble. But what they ended up, the reason that so many Democrats ended up voting for it is because, look, think about this. The White House is calling and saying, you can't do that because then you make the president look weak. This is supposed to be the leader of their party. This is supposed to be their presidential candidate.
It was like President Trump telling us to vote for a clean debt ceiling, which I didn't. But,
exactly,
but that was kind of the same thing.
And I opposed it as well. And so they were really in a box because they had a cruddy deal for the Democrats, but they also had their leader negotiated, so they were stuck. They didn't have a choice but to vote for it at that point.
Yeah, it seems like a lot better deal. Okay, so back to the surprise. I mean, so obviously there was just a ton of immediate backlash and from people I was surprised to hear from as well. And, making the same arguments we hear anytime people are against legislation. Well, it's like it falls short, doesn't do this. It's not as good as they say it is. And I'm like, okay, that's all true. I mean, maybe I think they're exaggerating on certain points. We could nitpick some certain points that have been claimed. But in the end, I would just do, okay, fine. I accept every criticism you have of the bill. Where's your bill? Like, where's the other one? So you were surprised by that, but go ahead. And also, is there anything we could have done differently to make people less vitriolic about it?
So we were literally still in negotiations, and I start getting text messages from people asking me, in fact, I'm not going to name names, but one person sent me something and said, "Is this accurate?" And of course, I'm in the middle of a negotiation. I'm not going to go through and read their talking points document. And so
that's some like newscaster sent.
No, it was actually somebody here. Somebody here.
But where'd they get it?
And I don't know the answer to that. But I then get a text from somebody else who was on our negotiating team that said, "Look what was just posted on social media," and it was a talking points thing, basically bad-mouthing the negotiation, suggesting we had already finished negotiating and that here were the components of it. Totally wrong. We were still negotiating, and goes out there trying to badmouth.
So was this like Saturday? I remember it in terms of the days that this was going on.
I got to tell you, everything runs together, but I'm guessing it was probably Saturday.
Over the weekend,
and so finally, hours later, I look at it, I'm like, "You've got to be kidding me!" And I text him back. I said, "No, this whole thing's wrong." But it had already been posted on social media, spreading like it was truth, and so we were already on our heels, trying to respond to something and sell something that had already been distorted or defined as something it wasn't, which, look, we were in negotiations. We couldn't be out there talking to the press and explaining what was in it. So I thought that was really an awful tactic. But look, what's most important, and you've said this, you go from a Republican-only package to something that the President of the United States has to sign. He had to sign something repealing one of his signature issues and rescinding $21 billion for IRS agents. Mm-hmm. You had to have him sign something that he said he would never do, was tightening work requirements for welfare programs. Yeah. You had to have him sign something putting administrative limitations on how much money they can spend through administrative actions. Right. I mean, like all these things that negotiating, the environmental streamlining, one of the last things that we negotiated, environmental environmental streamlining had to have him sign something that reverses, for the first time in 40 years, some of the ridiculous things.
How did that happen? Okay, so because on Saturday that wasn't in there. In the leaked stuff you're talking about, that wasn't in there. And I was like, man, even I was like, it's still better than nothing. So it's, and better than nothing means a yes vote generally. I think that's how I try to approach voting. But then NEPA reform got into it on Sunday, and that was a pretty big deal. So explain how that change happened.
Well, I want to be clear. That is another example of information that was just wrong that was on the outside. So people were texting me and calling and saying, hey, I heard permitting was dropped. Absolutely not true. It was never dropped.
Probably the most important part of the negotiation.
And it was
for Texas, for Louisiana.
Yeah, absolutely. So was it unresolved? Yes. Was it ever kicked out or closed out? No, it never was. That was misinformation, one of the many things that were said on the outside that just wasn't true. So it was one of the last things that was resolved. And look, again, I've got to give a lot of credit to the Speaker. The White House was pushing us. They were, doing all this saber rattling on default. Speaker of the House made it crystal clear. He said, I want it, because this was one of the things that did bubble up. And the Speaker got on the phone and he said, I want to be clear to you. He said, this deal is not being finalized without finalizing permitting. And so that caused a rush and I think a lot of concern on the White House side. They finally came to the table. I won't get into all the details, but I will just tell you that the initial negotiator was not operating in good faith. We began
Who are you negotiating with, actually? I didn't even ask that question. Like, who are you even talking to?
Well, so the main negotiators were Steve Ricchetti, who is Deputy Chief of Staff for the White House, Shalonda Young, who is the Director of the Office of Management and Budget, Louisa Terrell, who works for White House, and then her deputy as well, Michael. Those were the primary negotiators, but there were other, just like we brought in others for other things. Yeah. They did that a few times as well. On the permitting, I think some of the initial negotiators were operating in bad faith, saying things that I'm not sure if they just didn't understand or they were saying things that just weren't true. So we took a tactic right after the Speaker's phone call that as soon as that person started saying things that weren't accurate, we stopped them. We called them out, corrected the record, because we were doing this one on the phone at that point. It was probably 11 p.m. And that negotiation went on for a while. And so we continued to just call them out, correct them, and made it clear that this person was not operating in good faith or was not aware of a lot of the really key things that they needed to know for the negotiation. When they switched out negotiators, that's when everything began working much better, had much better, I think, just good faith or integrity in the negotiations. And that resulted in us getting the environmental permitting closed out. And look, we didn't get everything we wanted, but I'll tell you, it was probably about 2/3 of what was in the House bill, giving you an idea of how much we got in that part.
Yeah. I mean, I'd agree with that, and it's like I said, it's you got to operate within the context of political reality, and there was some bad faith arguments as we were arguing with our own side about this. I mean, obviously, I'm never sure when Democrats have good faith arguments, but in the end, a lot of them voted for it for the reasons you stated. I was surprised, I was conflicted. It's never fun to vote for a debt ceiling. It's sort of been inculcated into our conservative culture that you're just never supposed to support it. But obviously that's impossible. You have to, you can't not do it. If you can, maybe we should have a rule where you never do a clean one. And I've never voted for a clean debt ceiling, but the reason people ask, why do you even have a debt ceiling vote? Right. And that's an honest question. Why do we even have it? It shouldn't even exist in theory. And I would say, well, simply for political reasons, because we want to have to negotiate some breaks to our spending every single time. And it creates some drama, but maybe that drama is a little necessary. I mean, how do you feel about that?
I think it is absolutely necessary to have that negotiation. I mean, look, the analogy that so many people have used is the debt ceiling is like hitting your credit card limit. Your son or daughter calls and says, hey, Mom, Dad, I hit my credit card limit, and I don't have enough money to pay my bill this month. Would you help me? And so, look, I know I would tell my kids yes, but I also know that I would tell my kids, and before we do this, we're going to have a discussion about how you got here, how you incurred all this debt, and what we're going to do to pay it off to prevent this from happening again. Debt ceiling vote forces that discussion, which I think is necessary.
Right. In a way that a government shutdown, it kind of does too, but it's the brink isn't as severe. I mean, it just isn't. So it's important to do. What were some of the? How do you respond? So. Some of the arguments against it, again, from our own side were, these savings are gimmicky, they're not enforceable. There's so many different opinions, and it gets kind of complicated in the way we do budgeting. And as far as an answer to that, how do you generally respond to those?
Yeah. So look, let me tell you something. After being neck deep in these negotiations for weeks, is the federal budget gimmicky? Yes, it is. Is there parts of it that are disingenuous? Yes. One of the things that we began doing was plowing through those gimmicks and beginning to eliminate them. So part of what that means is going in and rescinding funds that never should have been appropriated to begin with. And so what we did in some cases is when we rescinded funds or took funds back from agencies, we use that, as is done in every budget and appropriations process. If you generate savings, it lowers your overall spending number. And so we did that, and I think that there was a misunderstanding by some people who came out aggressively against it, because I'll tell you, about a week after it passed, we sat down with them with all the spreadsheets. And here's my take. My take is that there's not a single detractor on this bill that actually understood it. And I know that's a bold statement, but I'm going to say it again. I don't think there was a single detractor on this bill, people who spoke against it and said things against it, that actually understood the numbers. Here's the reality. Dan, if you take defense and veterans off the table, and you look at all the other spending for EPA and Interior and all these other agencies that are out there doing crazy things, we effectively brought them down to somewhere around 2017 levels of spending, not right. 2024, 2017. You adjust for inflation, you look at all the savings and everything that we've done. You're going to see agencies in the appropriations process this year that are cut probably 30 and 40%, bringing them back to levels in the 1990s.
And we argue, and they say, well, that'll just get, change in appropriations. We'll roll over. And it's like, well, that's not an excuse not to vote for it now. I mean, but in the truth that we still control the appropriations process would be the counter argument. I mean, we're still according to this deal that we set out, and there's no reason to believe at the moment that would change.
The first step is that we can control what we do in the House. And so that's what we're doing. We can't control what a Democrat Senate majority does. And so we've got to put the best proposal on the board that we can in terms of the House. The Speaker's made clear that he is going to, at an absolute minimum, enforce these budget caps, but his goal is to drive spending even deeper on both the appropriations, the discretionary side, as well as on the mandatory side. And we're going to continue making efforts to reduce spending.
You guys brought up some interesting arguments in conference when we were all talking about this. Is like, in the end, we're negotiating over 11% of the budget. And so it was frustrating. It was disingenuous when people would say, "Oh, only $1.5 trillion," and it's like, well, do you want $6 trillion? Yeah. Fine, then I want you to tweet right now. Be a man. Go tweet right now that you want to cut Social Security and Medicare. Be a man and do it. Oh, you won't? Then shut up and sit down. That's how I would respond. Because I'm like, if you're going to make such bold arguments about how much we could have saved, well, then you need to put more things on the table. Oh, you're not willing to because your voters will be mad at you. Yeah. And I'll say that to most so-called conservative members. I hate disingenuous arguments, right? Yeah. I got in front of a conference and I told everybody, I was like, look, I don't like the politics of this. This sucks. I may vote against it, but I'll never lie to anybody about. I'll just say the politics suck, but I will not lie and say that we could have done better. I would have negotiated better. This is a crappy deal. I'm not going to lie and say that. It's just not true.
Yeah. Look, anybody who says you could have done better, you're right. You could have done better. We got.
But is that right?
98% of what we could have done. But the only way we could have done better is we had the benefit of hindsight. I think our team played this thing as close to perfect as you possibly could. Look, with the benefit of hindsight, I can look back and say, well, if we had done this first, but I'm talking stuff on the margins.
Yeah.
We kicked their butt. In this negotiation, we kicked their butt. You can look at the outcomes here. The president had to absolutely eat crow on one thing after the other in here, including not allowing him to spend like he had been spending in the past, which I couldn't even describe to you how much they were cringing and uncomfortable in these negotiations. We were making them eat these numbers.
Yeah. Well, you guys did a good job, and that's a good place to wrap since you've got a heart out literally right now. So, right. Garret, thanks for being on, and next time we'll bring in the scotch, and then we'll really get some secrets out of you.
There may or may not be some bourbon about 10 feet behind you, but happy to crack it next time.
All right, sounds good. Thanks for being on.